All right, and hello again. Welcome to part 2 of this mini-series on clouds. This is kind of where we want to be at the end. This is actually going to be in part 3. It's to show how to do this automatic resizing so that you can click just about everywhere in the sky and it will adjust the size based on something magic. That's something enabled in version 10, and we'll talk about that if you're curious. It's down here in the sidebar. At the very bottom there's a Z-scale guide, and what you need to make that happen is in the swap image simply have a grayscale that progresses from some sort of a dark level to a bright level, and whatever that level is will control the scale of your current custom brush on the fly. So we'll cover that in more detail in the next tutorial, but this one here I wanted to just show a few more ideas on how to actually make these clouds in the first place, right? So having a cloud like this, and I'm going to temporarily disable the swap image now, so I'm going to go clear that. There you go. So we have a cloud. It shows some great transparency, right? The opacity on the inside, transparent on the outside, and also actually a gradual transparency. If I erase this to dark, for instance, something like this, you can tell there's some nice progression on the transparency. For instance, if you have some other patterns in there already, let's say we render a cellular pattern or a brick texture, that's always a good way to see some sort of alteration, maybe a different color, something like this, and something a little bit more saturated there. Okay, so then as you go over, you can see the cloud is partly transparent, but it's not changing color, right? It doesn't have that edge glow, and that's really what we probably want to strive for. So I want to discuss how did I do that, right? The trick really is to not do the coloring first and then try to add the transparency, but actually to do the transparency first. That's what I did in this case. So I started with something that's white, because I'm thinking the clouds, even when they go to the edge, when we have a little bit of fluff and a little bit of transparency, they're still going to be white. It's just very little bit of it. Because of the transparency, it's going to fade out, but it's not supposed to be changing color. Now we can, if we want to, right? If we have a cloud that has a very strong silver lining on the end, it may go from gray to a bright white, or it may be on the shaded dark bottom side and it may end up going dark, but that's a different detail. The transparency itself, what I would recommend is we look at painting it right on it. So that's something we can do instead of using the selection tools that we've seen before, select by color, or some others like the lasso and the magic wand and so on. You can also paint that directly, and there's a couple of places where you can see that. One is right here when you right click on the brush tool, or if you pull down this little gadget, you'll see paint on alpha. And there's a couple of simpler ways and then a bit more elaborate. Let's just take a look at the hard 50. That's I think 50 pixels. And so you can draw your shape, and then when you let go, it actually transfers that into the alpha channel. So you've essentially painted on the alpha channel, and you can use that to go fill this in and make your entire cloud really not exist in color yet, but just in the alpha channel. Okay, so that's one starting point, is to understand that your brush, some of the brushes are predefined to paint on alpha. And so even if you already had some sort of a coloration there, let me go undo this. Where is my undo there? So I'm going to go and render something like, again, that brick texture, or something else like cold lava, why not? If I'm painting now, I'm not going to modify that grayscale image. It's still there. What I'm doing is I'm painting into the alpha channel, right? And that's with the left button, whereas with the right button, I'm unpainting. I'm removing from the alpha channel. So left button is one and right button is the other. Okay, now that was one of the brushes. That's the predefined paint on alpha brush. There's a soft one which has a soft edge, kind of a brush like an airbrush, and of course, that one will introduce some transitions, right? You can see a little bit of transitions. And again, the reason why I see it pink here when it's not selected is because under the selection menu, I have overlay enabled, right? You can turn that off. I think it's off by default, so maybe you want to turn it on. And so that's one type of brush we might want to use to just create the basic shape of our clouds. But obviously, we'd like to use some of the others too, and some that have a bit more of a fluffy, randomized look. And so there is a third one that's also interesting for a very quick development here, the blobby. And that one will introduce a bit of a blobby random edge to that. You can also use it on the inside. And then also, any of these, you could also use a transparent, let me go clear the selection. You could essentially have a much lower opacity on it. So as you paint, it's only doing a partial paint into the alpha. Right? You have to go over it many, many times to keep accumulating and getting it to the point where it's fully opaque. Right, so that indicates that you can actually also do a very soft, gradual transition on the transparency. Okay, so now there is one more type of brush we'd like to use, and that's not one of those three predefined. Right, these are just three predefined ones, but there's one more, which is just generally saying whatever brush I'm using, especially custom brushes. I'm not sure that it works with all of the particle brushes and so on, but the custom brushes, whatever image brush I'm using, I'd like that to go into the alpha. Right. So one place, I think there's one or two other places where you may enable that, but if you look over here in the brush settings, click on settings when you have the brush tool selected, click on settings, and that will open up the brush settings. Let me show that. Click on settings, there you go, and then go to the FX tab, and normally that's disabled, so make sure you enable it, and go down to the modal mode, which paints into alpha, and there's a couple of modes, but I would probably just say paint on alpha. Right, and so when you do that, the current brush will paint on alpha, but really you can switch to another brush. You can go to, for instance, you can go to the browser, the media browser, find your KB brushes, and you see KB cloud brush there. Select that, and now you have, well, right now it's still just okay. When you select that, it's actually going back to its own alpha mode. So you want to make sure you keep an eye on this here and enable, and stay on alpha, and paint on alpha. All right. So now you're actually painting onto the alpha channel with that brush. Now I did switch to this brush that's a little bit more like foliage, the bush 2. So I'm going to go back to this one. Again, remember that may also reset the alpha, so keep an eye on that. Enable FX, make sure it's on paint on alpha. And so now you have that cloud brush going into the alpha channel. All right, so let's clear the alpha. Let's clear the image. Actually, there's a Shift K we can use, or image there, clear. So here's the entire image blank and clean. And I'm going to go just draw sort of the shape of my clouds, understanding that I'm actually painting into the alpha channel. All right. And at this point, I don't need to see the shapes and the details of the cloud. I just want to be able to kind of do some weird little offsprings here. And then also some of them at much lower opacity. Now you can control that here by reducing the opacity up there, but also by increasing the step, the distance from one dab to the next, right? So when you do that, you can go and create very slight increases of opacity here, but it's not fully opaque, right? And so that's the interesting thing. You can also create perhaps a little plateau or something like that, like a beginning of an anvil shape, all sorts of different things. Plus the right button you can use to undo the opacity, right? To create, carve out some new transparency in there. Using the left button to add opacity, using the right button to remove, right? To make it more transparent again. So lots of different things that all go into the alpha channel. And you can always store that alpha channel to take a quick look at it as a grayscale image. You can go here to the selection menu and store alpha, and that stored image you can resize to make it a little bit bigger, and you can see how that is really a grayscale image from the alpha channel, an 8-bit value. And you essentially now have sort of the mask in which you want to fit your cloud. You also have a very good idea of roughly what that cloud will look like. In terms of coloration, though, you might want to add a little bit of shading. So that's when you need to get out of the alpha mode, disable the FX, and just keep using that same brush or others, right? And paint now the color into that. So you have essentially created and defined the alpha channel. Maybe it will do a little bit, let's see, we have defined the alpha channel or the shape of the cloud. Now we're going to do some detail work here to add a little bit of 3D look to it, right? So like if there's sunshine hitting it from the top, we'll probably have a little bit of darkening on the bottom. And then depending on what structure we want to convey here, we might want to have a little bit of darkening on these blobs here too. And so that's how you can create a cloud with very sophisticated shapes and little branches and fluff and stuff. And the whole thing is well defined in the alpha channel as far as what to actually pick up. So the only thing you need to do then is to go to the brush, use selected as brush, pick this up, and store that brush to have a safe copy. Well, it's not 100% safe, right? You still want to save that, but you can do that straight from the brush menu, right? You can save that and save it out as a PNG. What we'll do is see what we can do then with that brush, in terms of painting with that. I mean, you can manage it here and make it a little bit smaller. Let's go to paint. Make sure we pick that custom brush, make sure we see it, because it's too transparency right now, too transparent. So let's make sure we make it fully opaque. There it is. And so you can paint with that. It still has the randomness of the prior parameters, so I want to get rid of those actually. Size, I want to show it at 100, but I want the opacity, the step distance perhaps a little bit reduced. But most importantly, I don't want the random behavior on that, right? You notice how it's doing this random angle and size and position. So all of these need to go. Random angle, that's already keeping it in the same orientation. Random size, always the same size. Well, there's a speed perhaps that's controlling. Speed scale, that also needs to go. Because otherwise, if you have the speed scale, as you go slowly, you got the size, but if you go faster, you see it go smaller. And if you have negative speed scale, it's the opposite direction. You go slowly, it's small, and you go faster, it gets bigger. So you want to get rid of that. Let's say we want to bring this back down to 0. There you go. So always the same size, and then random position. Let's get rid of that. So now the cloud is very predictable as to where it's going to go if we stamp it down. To actually stamp it down, I think we need to have this this step. This may be a glitch or a bug, if you want to call it that. This is something probably we'll have to improve. To allow it to stamp down, I think we need to step down to about 1 or 2. So that way it's actually going to appear there. But let's see now what we can do. If we have any sort of background, let's say from the filter, transform, render, where's my render? There it is, render sky. Let's say we have a sky filter like this, right? A little bit more saturated on the color for the sky. There you go. Okay, so let's say we make this our initial image and we want to bring our clouds in front of that. All right, well, so that's exactly what we do next, is to say, okay, let's bring it at small size far away, right? And maybe even a little bit more transparent because it kind of blends into this haze. So we want the opacity to be a little bit lower. There you go. Then we maybe also the hue saturation value we can work with here. Hue saturation value. So when you look at that, the value farther distance is okay, but the saturation should go away. So it kind of blends a bit more into a grayish tint. And then as they are coming closer, so these are the far ones, and then as they're coming closer, you make them bigger, but you also increase the saturation a little bit. Now that's particularly useful if the clouds are not just white. These are mostly white or grayish, white so there is not much hue change. But if they do have a little bit of blue, because if you painted colors into them, they might have blue. They might even have a reddish tint if it's a sunset condition. You might you might have a couple of other colors that you want to reveal in that saturation. But just as far as like painting it right in here, but most importantly also, it's a nice asset that you can use now to, for instance, have this cloud go in an animation, as we saw in the prior part. Let's say, for instance, we create an animation of this initial sky. In fact, I'm going to do this just for the fun of it. I'm going to say, let's do a 3-second animation. Oh, let's make it a little bit bigger. 150 there, 5 second long, at 30 frames per second, right? Frame rate is 30. We get 150 frames, and I'm going to actually animate the sky, the background sky, into that. Right? So I'm going to go temporarily. I'm going to disable the preview of the clouds. There you go, the custom brush, I mean. And let's go and animate the sky into that. So that would be render, filter, render, sky, and actually animate it, right? But first, just adjust the parameters a little bit. Iteration, let's make it crispy, not too detailed. Something like this. Okay, and then animate, and then indicate in which direction the clouds are actually animating. They're moving. So if we give it a speed X, it's sideways. Positive X will make it move to the right, if I recall. Let's say we want them to move towards us, so that would be the speed Y. And we'll give it, I don't remember how big this is where you need to just experiment a little bit to see if that's fast enough. Let's give it a 1. I think that's something like that. And then I want the shapes to change as well. I don't want the clouds to stay the same shape. I want them to change through Z space, the fractal Z space. So I'm going to go and make them change pretty quickly, actually. And okay that. So now it's generating these sequence of frames with the rendered sky. The cloud shapes do undergo some slight changes, and they're moving towards us or over our head. That's really just to have a starting point of the animation. What I'm really interested in, of course, is to have my cloud that I have in a brush also animate on top of that afterwards. Right? So we'll see that we can quite easily use that cloud asset, export it as a PNG with transparency, or export it in order to use it in things like Anime Studio, things like Carrara, things like Lightwave, any of your favorite 2D or 3D animation tools. You'll be able to use that asset, but you can also use it right here. So here's my initial animation that I use from the background. And I'm going to go store that quick, just so part of the workflow should be to occasionally store it to disk, just in case I run out of battery here, or I have a glitch and it crashes or something, God forbid. I'm going to go have a stored copy on disk, and then now I'm going to go use the brush keyframer, right? Because with the brush keyframer, I can place and animate that brush image. Right, I can, for instance, I can have it start from very far away. That will be down on this timeline here, right? You can see the background sky. Let's say I want to have this cloud go in sync with it. I'm going to do a linear transition. I'm going to go far away back there. And in fact, initially I want it fully transparent, so we don't even see it. So I'm going to go opacity 0. Boom. And I want perhaps 1 second of such animation with nothing changing. So still another keyframe. And then I want the cloud to come right in front of us here, make it fully opaque, and also bring it back to normal size, close enough, and up a little bit. Keyframe that. And then at that point, I'll just let it be here, or perhaps come in a little bit bigger still, but just tiny little bit only, so not so much. Okay, keyframe that. And one more thing you could do here is actually, as you preview it, you could perhaps even give it a little bit of a rotation angle, right? Have it kind of wobble, or an additional position left and right, like a little slalom move. So you could say something like here, we actually move over to the left, and rotate a little bit, something like this. I don't know if you can tell, it's very subtle here because it's still so transparent. And then here we'll go to the right and we'll rotate the other way, keyframe that, and then here we go. So here we have a somewhat more interesting animation. Let's go render that. So that's one way to work with this brush keyframer. And you can see here, if I turn off my brush preview, I now have an animation with this cloud of mine rendered on top of the background sky, and it's got some nice good transparency along the edges. And that was all we wanted to see in this tutorial. So thanks for watching. Stay tuned for the next part, which will be focused on how to make it change transparency as we paint it. Right, this is again with what we actually just briefly showed in the beginning, where you have in the area with the grids and artist guides, you have an extra parameter now, and unfortunately I'm not seeing it here in the capture, but at the bottom of this where the grids and the artist guides are, there is an additional option called Z-Scale Guide, which will work with an alpha channel. So you need to have, with a swap channel, with a swap image. You need to have a gradient in the swap image to make it scale. We'll talk to you soon about that in the part 3 of this tutorial mini-series. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you soon.